My name's Jack, and I've been a trucker for over 20 years now. I've seen a lot on the open roads. Crazy weather, weirdos at truck stops, accidents that'll make my stomach turn. But nothing prepared me for what I saw last Tuesday night. It started off like any other haul. I was driving my usual route from Denver to Salt Lake City. The load was nondescript, some wood and metal parts that I never bothered to really look at. I prefer the mystery because it makes the time pass faster. About an hour outside of Green River, Wyoming, it started to snow. Lightly at first, but soon the flakes were coming down hard and fast. Snow doesn't usually bug me much. I learned to take it really slow and steady. But this storm seemed different. The snow was wet and heavy, with a charge to it that raised the hairs on my arms. I turned on the CB to check for any weather updates. All I heard was static at first, but then a panicked voice broke through. The transmission cut out again. That decided it for me. I turned off at the next exit and headed back north on the frontage road. I squinted against the snow, trying to make out any sign of a wreck. At a mile, I finally spotted flickering hazard lights in the ditch. Whoever it was had gone off the shoulder in the low visibility. I pulled off carefully and made my way down to the wreck. A small SUV crumpled nose first into the steep drainage gully. As I got closer, I could make out a figure hunched over the steering wheel, unmoving. I rapped on the driver's side window but got no response. Fearing the worst, I tried the door and found it unlocked. The interior dome light flickered on, revealing the driver. It was a woman with matted blonde hair and blood streaking down her face. Her eyes stared vacantly ahead. I reached for her wrist to check for a pulse. Her skin was icy cold, but I thought I detected a faint, slow beat. Looking closer, her breath was making the faintest fog on the glass. She was alive but likely hypothermic and seriously hurt. I knew I had to get her warm and call for an ambulance quickly. I squeezed my large frame back out of the SUV and into the full brunt of the storm, heading for my truck. The voice faded into static again before I could respond. I checked my GPS. I was only about 10 miles south of that location. I debated whether to stop or not, but the conditions were deteriorating, and I knew my rig wasn't built for off-road rescues. The voice suddenly returned, even more frantic than before. Visibility was down to just a few feet as the snow continued its relentless assault. I grabbed my emergency blanket and radio and headed back to the woman. But peering into the SUV, I now saw she was gone. Only a smear of blood remained on the cracked glass where her head had rested. I spun around, searching the whiteness for any sign of her, but there were no footprints, no trail to follow. It was like she had simply vanished. I tried the CB again, but it was dead. No static, no voices, just cold silence. Even my radio was quiet, not even a hiss of dead air. I checked my cell, but of course it had no signal. I was well and truly alone on that remote stretch of highway. The wind kicked up again, screaming as it whipped through the trailer hitches and bare trees by the road. It sounded almost human, like the howls of someone in terrible pain. Goosebumps prickled my arms as I hurried back to the warmth and familiarity of the truck cab. But as I went to pull myself up into the seat, a sickening sweet stench washed over me. I gagged and looked around for the source. That's when I spotted it. Just below my rear wheels, a gnarled shape lay crumpled in the snow. I slowly moved closer, all my senses on high alert. As I came alongside it, it was a middle-aged man. His torso had been savagely torn open, and innards were strewn around him. Rib bones jutted from a blackened cavity like macabre wings. I doubled over and vomited, my mind reeling. I was backing away when I slipped on a patch of icy blood. As I sprawled on the ground, something splintered under my hand. I held it up to the truck's headlights, a large Bluetooth headset, the kind truckers wear for hands-free calling while driving. The truth hit me like a hammer. There had been no stranded woman, no cry for help. It was this man, all along, luring others to the same grim fate he had suffered. I scrambled to my feet and leapt into the truck, locking the doors. I gunned the engine, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I tried to pull back onto the highway, the wheels just spun uselessly. I felt a dragging weight at the back. Lurching from the cab, I swept my flashlight across the trailer. A metal chain was stretched taut from the rear axle into the darkness. Something was back there toying with me. I jumped back inside and tore open the glove box for my pistol. With shaking hands, I fired 2 shots at the chain binding me in place. The links shattered, and I peeled out, trailer be damned. As I sped into the night, the storm faded rapidly in my mirrors, almost as if it had never existed. An eerie, calm, moonlit landscape stretched before me. No snow, no wind, just silence. I drove on, white-knuckled, hyper-alert. Slowly, my heartbeat returned to normal as I put miles between myself and that wretched stretch of road. After an hour, I came across a sleepy truck stop and rolled into the parking lot like a man saved. As I shut off the rumbling engine, I thought I could still detect a new vibration, a tinny rattling from somewhere in the trailer. Fresh dread creeping over me, I stepped out into the fluorescent glare of the lot, drew my gun again, and crept toward the rear doors. Taking a deep breath, I swung them open. Nothing but my ordinary cargo stared back. The noise had fallen silent. Still, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched, of malice lurking just out of sight. I returned to the cab, exhausted and shaken. But I didn't sleep at all that night or the next. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the dark, twisted forms dancing at the edge of my vision. I've been driving trucks for 15 years now, and I know these old country roads like the back of my hand. That brisk October afternoon was no different than any other. I had a delivery in the next town over, just a short jaunt. The leaves were starting to turn, painting the landscape in vibrant hues of red and orange. It was peaceful. I drove for hours without seeing another vehicle. That route was lightly traveled, but the isolation never bothered me because I enjoyed the solitude. On that day, an uneasiness settled over me. I couldn't put my finger on why. The weather was fine, no different than any other autumn day, but something felt off. The further I drove, the deeper I sank into the countryside. Ramshackle houses and dilapidated barns darted past my window, but no soul stirred. No cars passed me, heading in either direction. It was like I was the only person left in the world. The uneasy feeling grew stronger. I shook myself, trying to break the spell of loneliness that had come over me. I turned on the radio, flipping through stations, but only a static answered. Stranger and stranger. I chuckled to myself. I'd been alone too long and let my imagination get the best of me. These back roads always seemed haunted. It was all in my head. Up ahead, I spotted the first signs of life in miles, an old farmhouse set back from the road. In front, an elderly woman labored away in the yard, pushing an ancient manual lawnmower through the grass. I let out a sigh of relief. The total isolation must have just rattled me. As my truck approached, the woman stopped her mowing and stood up straight, watching me pass. I lifted my hand in greeting, assuming she was just curious about strangers. These folks weren't used to seeing traffic back here. I maintained my speed, not wanting to kick up any rocks or dust in her direction. But as I drove by in my rearview mirror, I could see the woman still standing there watching me, stock still. The lawnmower lay abandoned on the ground beside her. Slowly she turned, rotating her body to keep her eyes locked on my truck as I continued down the road. The deliberate movement seemed so eerie and so unnatural. She tracked me until I was out of view and her posture rigid. I drove on, disquieted by the encounter. There was something sinister in the old woman's actions, like a predator tracking unwary prey. The uneasy feeling from before returned in force. I found myself watching the mirrors, half expecting to see her in the road behind me. The empty landscape no longer seemed peaceful but ominous. What secrets did these dilapidated houses hold? What horrors haunted these isolated backroads? The questions repeated in my mind until I finally reached my destination just as the sun dipped below the horizon. After making my delivery, I debated whether to take the risk of returning through that deserted stretch of rural isolation, but it was the fastest way back home. I couldn't let an old lady and my overactive imagination deter me. As I drove back along the route as darkness fell, my headlights seemed feeble against the oppressive gloom and I kept my speed steady, fighting the urge to floor it. The road unspooled before me, barren and lonely. Approaching the abandoned farmstead, I held my breath, half expecting to see that silent spectre with her dead-eyed stare waiting for me. But the house was still, the yard overgrown and empty. But as I passed the property, the cab filled with the stench of rot and burning rubber. In the rearview mirror, I could see an eerie green glow approaching fast. Terror surged through me as I realized the old woman was after me. I pressed the pedal down, determined to outrun my pursuer. But the lights drew closer and closer, impossibly fast. The stench grew overwhelming, like a charnel house on fire. Suddenly, my rig was filled with an unearthly shriek that rattled the windows and made my teeth ache. This was not an old woman, but was indeed some vengeful demon or howling phantom that haunted these lands. I begged the rig for more speed, but it was no use. The shrieking green spectre was nearly on top of me. In desperation, I swerved hard to the right, tires leaving the pavement and kicking up dirt as I tore through the brush. I drove all through the night, heedless of damage to my rig or direction. I just knew I had to get far away from that otherworldly evil. When dawn broke, I finally stopped, exhausted and overwhelmed. I don't understand what would have happened if that shrieking demon had caught me, but I know I will never again take the deserted rural roads for granted. Something ancient and evil haunts those lonely stretches, lying in wait for the unwary traveler. My haven is now a hotbed of horror, and I will not soon forget the terrors glimpsed in my rearview mirror. I've been a trucker for various companies for 7 years. The endless blacktop stretched out before me as I drove through the night. My eyes were growing heavy, but I fought against the urge to stop. I had to make Omaha by morning. Just as I felt myself starting to nod off, the lights of a small town appeared on the horizon. I breathed a sigh of relief. A quick stop for gas, a splash of cold water on my face, and a jolt of caffeine would get me through the last few hours. The town was eerily quiet as I pulled into the gas station. The fluorescent lights hummed and flickered, casting an unnatural glow over the pumps. Aside from the pimple-faced teen half asleep behind the counter, the place was deserted. After filling up and grabbing an extra-large coffee, I soon returned to the lonesome highway. Darkness enveloped me once again. With the help of the caffeine coursing through my veins, I flew down the road, putting miles between me and that creepy little town. About an hour later, the coffee was taking its toll. I regretfully realized I shouldn't have downed that extra large in one go. My bladder was screaming at me for relief. I scanned the road ahead, but there were no signs indicating a rest stop anytime soon. Then I spotted it, a cleared area on the right shoulder, recognizable as an unofficial rest stop. After pulling over and shutting off the rumbling engine, an oppressive silence filled the cab. The only light came from my headlights, barely illuminating the brush and trees surrounding the rest stop. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. I shivered as the cold night air enveloped me. The sooner I relieved myself, the sooner I could get out of there. I walked to the passenger side, not wanting to venture too far into the dark forest. As I took care of business, I clicked on my flashlight and pointed it at the tree line. I watched for any sign of movement, but all was still. After zipping up, I leaned against the side of the truck and pulled out a cigarette. As I lit it, the brief flare of the lighter cast wavering shadows across the pavement. I couldn't shake the feeling of weird movement. Inhaling deeply, I turned and stared out into the void. The dark swallowed up the beam of my flashlight. As my eyes strained against the blackness, I thought I saw a shape emerge from the trees. I was scared by sudden terror. The shape moved slowly toward me. As it drew closer, the figure of a man materialized on the fringe of my flashlight. Disheveled hair hung limply over his gaunt face. His clothing was ripped and stained. But the most frightening of all were his eyes. Deeply sunken into sallow cheeks, they glinted with madness and bloodlust. We stared at each other for a breathless minute. Then he began shuffling toward me, arms outstretched. I fumbled for the door handle and dove into the cab, slamming and locking the door behind me. Within seconds, I had the truck roaring to life. The headlights flared on, momentarily blinding the frightening figure. Jamming the gear shift into drive, I floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward violently, flinging the creepy man aside. As I sped off into the night, my eyes darted to the rearview mirror. The man was slowly picking himself up off the pavement. He stood motionless, watching as I disappeared down the dark stretch of endless highway. I drove on in terror, my hands numb and shaking against the steering wheel. I didn't dare slow down for anything. All I could do was keep driving until I reached the light of morning. The image of the man's crazed eyes flickered through my mind. As the first pink rays of dawn peeked over the horizon, I finally began to breathe normally again. but I knew I would never forget that creepy man who emerged from the void to haunt my dreams forever.